presentation mode. All right. Well, good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining me this morning for Virtual 19. This is a session on telling English learners story with data visualizations. And I'm Shaylee Santiago. If you're online on Twitter, please feel free to tweet Virtual19, or you can tweet at me at HSESL Teacher. So a few objectives for our session this morning. First of all, you will be, by the end of the session, you'll be able to explain why telling stories with data visualizations is important, especially in terms of advocating for our English learners. You will also be able to list data that you want to include in visualizations, and we'll discuss some tools to create data visualizations. Along the way, I do hope that you'll put comments in the chat box on YouTube. I'm trying to follow along. I can see several of you are on the session. Thanks for joining in. Elizabeth, I know you just presented, so I appreciate you joining me for this session as well. And others, I see Jacqueline Zacharias and Erica Evans, Damaris Gutierrez from San Antonio, and Liam Montano from Vietnam. So we've got international participants. And of course, Tan. I know that Tan's on as well from Vietnam, or from Laos, yeah. Okay, so let's jump into the content then. The first objective is around why we would use data visualizations. And so I've put several points on the side. For one thing, when we think about numbers, it's often hard for us to process. And so having a visual representation makes it more engaging and accessible when we're analyzing data. Data is important and certainly has a place, especially when we're talking from a big picture macro view of program evaluation and also accountability for student results. So here's a quote from Simon Sinek in his Leaders Eat Last book. He talks about the dangers of over-reliance on data, specifically when we boil everything down to just numbers, a numerical abstraction, and we lose the human component. And so that's a danger that we want to make sure that we're avoiding. And so part of what I'm talking about today is how we can balance the data with the stories of our students to make that data picture more humanized. Also, it makes it easier to relate to and for people to remember. And so we can start at the big macro level, like national data or state data or district level data, or perhaps even data from your school. And then we can zoom into specific examples and illustrations at the student or the small group level. And also data plays an important role, pairing it with stories when we're advocating for our learners. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in this session. So this is a point where I'm going to attempt to switch back to my camera view and see if we have some responses to the question I have there for you. What examples do you have about why visualizations and data are important? So if you're online and you can type in your response in the comment box, I'm looking at those comments. If you are on Twitter or other social media, then feel free to chime in that way. So what are some examples of how you've used data or why you think visualizations are important for sharing data with other people? So pause for just a second. I'm going to check my Twitter feed as well. Okay. Well, I don't see any immediate responses to that question. I know people are still kind of introducing themselves, and I see my head swiveling around as I check multiple screens. So I'm going to go back into screen share, back to the presentation, and I'll check for those responses later on and see if I can't respond to some of you in Twitter and YouTube comments later. Okay. And present. So our second objective has to do with listing different kinds of data to present. And in getting ready for this, I realized I wanted to focus on the macro and the micro, the importance of including both components. But I don't have a ton of specific examples for you today just because of the time. However, in getting prepared, I came across this quote in a resource from Christina Torres. And she talks about how Sometimes we focus on assessments and the data that comes from them, but really we need to balance that with making connections with our students. And so I so appreciated that perspective, the mindset that she was highlighting about that data should be in service of our interactions and the relationships that we're building with students, that the data is not the ultimate goal or outcome of what we are wanting. It rather helps us measure that and track it. So I gave some general categories of data, but I want to encourage you as you're thinking about data to consider what's the purpose of how you're going to use the data. Are you using it for instruction? So are you looking for formative data that can help you decide how to fine tune the instruction you're giving in your classroom to know where your students are at currently and where you can help them go next? Are you using data to evaluate materials or a program? Perhaps it's about reporting requirements that come from the state and the federal government, especially around our English learner programs. There are different requirements that we have to report out on. And that would include things like demographics and language and academic proficiency as well. And then another area, you might be monitoring student growth or progress. And so on our little diagram here, that's the green that represents language growth. But you'll notice in yellow in the center, the demographics, I put that as kind of the foundational or the central piece, because often demographics get shared out in these other areas. As we're looking at equity, demographics is a main factor. We disaggregate the data by different categories so we can compare how students of various groups are performing in relation to their peers from different groups. And so demographics is kind of a central piece of it. So when we're talking about demographics, here are just a few different things that we often include: the student's language background, so the home language, the race and ethnicity. When we're talking about English learners, one kind of key differentiator is if they were born in the United States or if they were born abroad. And then what grade or year are they in school? What level are they at? When we think about language growth for our students, we need to have some sort of baseline. So that may be the screener that we gave them when they first came in and qualified for an English learner program, or it may be a previous year's performance on the same assessment. And so then usually language growth we're measuring at an annual rate because of the requirement in the United States for annual summative proficiency assessments, English language proficiency assessments. But we might also look in terms of, did they change levels in terms of the ELPA 21 is the assessment used in Iowa currently, which is the state that I'm in. And so the passable levels are emerging, progressing, or proficient. So did the student change a level, either in their overall proficiency or in the domain scores of the subtests? And we can even think of it in terms of quantity. So how much did they grow? Did they grow one level? Did they grow 2 levels? 2 levels would be an advanced quantity of growth. But I also encourage you to think about the scaled score. The scaled score allows you to do a finer tuned analysis, because sometimes students will show growth on their scaled score, but the level may not change. And that can also help if they're changing between different grade bands of the test. Often the scaled score will be something that still transfers across those various grade bands. And the third kind of big category is around target metrics. And by this one, really what I mean is a way for us to determine if we're meeting the goals of our language programs in terms of the number or the percentage of students who are considered long-term English learners. They've been in our program probably 5 years or more is the common definition. Or the number and proficiency, or percentage rather, of students who are making annual growth in the language proficiency assessment. And so both of these kind of examples require that we have multiple data points to compare from, for example, one year to the next. But it's also great for us to not just think about ourselves or our own district when we're looking at this kind of data, but we should be considering state and national data as reference points and comparison points. So keep those ideas in mind. And then I also wanted to highlight the fact that equity and advocacy can be driven by the data. And so this involves disaggregating data by subgroups. But then also, as the teachers or the school personnel who are analyzing that data, we need to be thinking about how we have framed the data that we're looking at. And we need to be aware of different challenges regarding our own lens in terms of implicit bias, especially as someone who's a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in America, the United States of America. I need to be very cognizant of that kind of frame that I bring to analyzing the data. And then finally, it's really a call for us to take action to make some changes at the systemic level. And so this is where data can play a huge role in raising people's awareness about discrepancies that exist, helping highlight the opportunity gap that may exist for different groups of our students, and then beginning to point the way for us in terms of what we should do for next steps and the narrative that we're telling around the data that we're sharing out, especially with stakeholders in our communities. So the big thing I wanted to say for this part in terms of what data to share is that it's an excellent idea that we can put profiles of students with the student demographics. And so this is one little section of an EL brochure that my district created a couple years ago. And so you see on the far right that there are little highlights of different students, and they were each asked a question. And so you can see their response. Their photos are there as well. But then on the other side, we have some demographic data. And in a moment, I'll show you the full page because you're kind of missing the demographics in this particular screenshot. But I wanted to pause again and ask you about other types of data that you use in your district or your work that you're doing. And so I'm coming back to the screen so you can see me live in person. And looking at the chat box to see if there are comments that people are putting in to answer the question about what other data, because I'm sure I did not include everything that's out there. There's so many different possibilities. So I'm taking a peek at Twitter to see if we have any comments on there as well. So I see from Karen, she says, we use data to determine program and services best suited for the student. Someone else is commenting about using data to show growth. So instead of the standardized proficiency of where others think that the student should be, they're focused primarily on growth. So that's the idea of there might be a certain cut mark for proficiency. And if we instead look at how much growth the student is making, especially English learners from one year to the next, often we see that growth coming in leaps and bounds before they can hit the proficiency bar. And so by focusing on growth, that helps us have a more realistic picture of what's going on with them. And from Shauna, yes, graduation rates and dropout rate data, especially when we're talking about evaluating our programs, those are key metrics that we want to be considering. And I didn't get those on my slide, so thanks for chiming in about that. Let me go back then to the presentation and we'll move on to the third objective and present. So the third one has to do with how to create visualizations. And again, in this short little 20-ish minutes this morning, I don't have a lot of time to go into great detail, but I did want to highlight a few things for you. So here are a few different tools. These are things that I have at least attempted to use. First, I'd encourage you to co-opt existing tools that probably already are in your district, and things like student information systems. Most assessment systems these days do a nice job of giving us some sort of visual of the data, the performance of a student, and I find that they're becoming better and better at doing that. So you might already have something built into your assessment system that will give you a visual of your students' performance. Then I encourage you to maximize things like spreadsheets, charts and graphs in spreadsheets. Google Sheets does an awesome job of taking your data and automatically creating a chart or a graph for you, and then you can tweak it as you need to. And so in a minute, I'm going to show you a couple examples of ones that I made from Google Sheets. Within Sheets as well, using things like formulas to help you calculate growth, for example. Conditional formatting lets you highlight by color different boxes, so you can mark kind of students who might be performing at higher levels or lower levels, so you have a quick visual to focus your attention on areas of concern. And then even pivot tables that let you pull data and kind of combine factors. And honestly, pivot tables is something I'm still figuring out how to do. So I can't answer many questions about that, but I know that there's a lot of awesome functionality that comes with pivot tables. And then other tools to use, things like infographics and brochures. I showed you a quick preview of a brochure that we made in my district, and infographics were a part of that. So there's different infographic tools that are out there, some of which are free, others of which cost money to use them. And then in many states, there's some sort of a data dashboard or like a district level report card that the state compiles information on. And so data dashboards, while they tend to be kind of a lot of numbers and more abstract data, they can be good places to kind of show you where you might want to dig in more from that macro level to zoom into more of a micro level to see what's happening with some of your students. So again, I want to encourage you that whichever tools you're using, that you follow different tips or tricks to help you make sure that you're humanizing the data. And so one of those is just having photos of the students as part of the information that you're sharing out about them. I think just that visual of the students' faces can do a lot to help you remember, what it is that you're looking at, and that's not just the numbers, but there are real people and students, no less, behind the numbers. Okay, so here's a few examples. Most of these are from my district and fairly recent data. This first one is a data distribution chart showing by grade levels, starting on the far left, it's kindergarten, all the way up to 12th grade. And this shows you how many English learners we had in our district at the fall, around our count date, certified enrollment date. The different colors represent their proficiency level. So red would be students who were performing at the emerging level. Yellow would be the progressing level. And then you see just a few greens, and those green ones are students who were proficient on the English language assessment, but they had not met other exit criteria. And in Iowa, our exit criteria just changed this year. So for fall, we shouldn't have anybody who's green like that, because now our only exit requirement is proficiency on our English language proficiency assessment. By the way, I want to shout out Ayana Cooper. I heard her present last summer, and she was advocating for disaggregating your data in this form, the distribution across grade levels. And so because of her and the presentation I heard, that's why I created this chart for my district this past year. Then here is another one. This is a template from Lisa Wymore, who's an Iowa consultant for Title III English learners in Central Rivers Area Education Agency. There is a link to her presentation that I heard her present about, and she's got some tools she's compiling and hoping to present about. So far that is not available for wide distribution just yet, but stay tuned as she hopes to be sharing out more in recent months. So what this data or tool is a template around English language proficiency domain levels, and it shows if students dropped a level, didn't have a change in level, grew by one level, or had accelerated growth, growing 2 or more levels in the domain scores from this past school year. So this is based on our most recent ELPA 21 data from the 2018-2019 school year. And seeing it this way at the district level helped us identify, we already kind of had an idea that writing was an area of weakness, but when we look at how many of our students either dropped or didn't make growth in writing, it was over 75% of our students who were stagnant or dropped a level. And so that was a huge trigger for us that we need to focus more on writing in my district. And so that's helping us determine what an area of focus will be for our next school year in our instruction in English learner classes. Then shifting kind of to the individual or the micro level again, here's a template. This one was made using Google Docs and something called, oh brother, Autocrat is the tool to auto-populate the data from a spreadsheet. So I have all the data on students in this massive spreadsheet in Google Sheets, and I'm able to pull in the data for different school years. And so in this particular sample one, it shows a student who started with us in second grade, and we had his listening or his ELPA scores. Listening was 3, reading 3, speaking 1, writing was 3. So his overall level of performance was progressing. And then as a third grader in 2016-17, you can see the growth he made. He went up to 4 in listening and 4 in speaking from a 1 in writing. That's significant growth, but he was still at progressing. And then as a fourth grader in the 2017-18 school year, he was proficient. 5, 4, 5, 4 were his profile scores. And then we also have Iowa assessment data. That's our state standardized assessment. And so I didn't get it filled in for this year, but the idea is then you can see in kind of one snapshot for an individual student, the growth that he made over time, both in language proficiency scores and academic achievement. And then finally, here is the program brochure with the demographic data in kind of infographic format, and also profiles juxtaposed together. So this is one little trifold brochure that we have available to give out to new families, to give out to the teachers in our district, to give out to the public with the different taxpayers in our school system. And it's been great for helping to raise awareness. We also use this as an advocacy piece. We're sharing information with, for example, senators at the United States congressional level. TESOL Advocacy Day is coming up, and I know that the Mid-TESOL representatives will be there, and they have this document to share to our Congress people as they're talking with them about English learners. Okay, so I see a question from someone, but let me post the question I want you to be thinking about and sharing, and then I'll address the question I see in the chat. So the question for you is, what tools do you use? Are there some that you have used in your district that you like? What would you share out with others about different kinds of tools and options that are out there? And the question that I see from Damaris, she says, could you tell us more about the program mentioned to populate from sheets into docs for the students' historical data? It's Autocrat. It's one of those things that I barely know how to use myself. Usually I have to work with my tech coach to make it work right. But I think if you Google Autocrat, you can find some information about it. It involves some kind of coding stuff, like you use, I think they're like hashtags that you mark the points that you want to fill in the Google Doc, and that's connected to the information in the sheet where you've compiled all that data that you're going to use to populate. So Autocrat is the program that I use to make that work. But like I said, I know just enough to sort of make it work. Usually I need some coaching assistance to work out the bugs on it. So it's definitely something a little more advanced. Okay, yep, Autocrat. And then I'm looking back to see other comments. So from Cassie, she says, we have global data, but it's hard to show individual student growth over time. And so she likes the example I showed you from Autocrat. So again, feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to share my contact information at the end, as well as it was at the beginning of the presentation. And I'd be happy to interact with you more after the fact. So let me go back one final time. I have just a couple more slides to wrap up, and then we'll see if there's any final questions. Okay, so one more quote for you, kind of the big concept or the takeaway, a quote from Einstein: everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. So I encourage you to keep in mind what it is that is important, what it is you're trying to count, and what level or degree of importance that has. Are you focused on what you really need to be focused on? Is maybe another way to say that. And for me, it's about the students and what they're learning and what kind of progress they're making. So just a few references here for you. As I said, I'm happy to interact with you more directly if you have questions about where anything was coming from. And then finally, to review our objectives, I can explain why telling stories with data visualizations is important. And again, for me, it comes down to that narrative that we're sharing out about our students from an equity and an advocacy point of view. And so I've used the hashtag advocacy for ELs there. Listing the data to include. So sometimes we feel like we can share a ton of information, and perhaps we need to dial it back a little bit and focus on what things are most important. And I'm mostly speaking to myself when I say that, because I know I have a tendency to do that. And then the third objective is around tools for creating data visualizations. And really, I feel like I just gave you a tease of what's out there, but I hope that by seeing a few examples, it's given you some ideas of what you can do and how you might share data in your district or area. Okay, so thank you again for participating with me today. Really appreciate having so many of you on, seeing the comments, people from across the United States and literally around the world. So thanks for joining in with Virtuelle today. I wish you all the best.